Chapter 15, Archer. It wa'n't long before they reached the clearing. "This wa'n't in the plans. I'm going to catch a earful when I get home. To put it frank, it's just fantastic. I bring him out here all the time and nothing like this happens, but then it does," she said, sarcastically. "Hey, it does happen to the best of them. Give it some time, it's bound to turn up," he said, peering from side to side for Martin, but he was nowhere to be seen. "Martin, you out there? Martin?" he said, pausing a moment before crouching along the dirt to rest. "It's weird, your brother leaving you here. Are you too close?" she asked him, leaning against the carriage. The infant inside had calmed down by now and was interested in a toy she had handed him. "It's ironic, really. We were close at one point in time. We were young kids, so it's hard to say. My brother's a bit complicated, and not in the same category as others. He's pretty much in a breed of his own," he said, admiring her a foot away. "I could never truly understand why he does what he does. It can be overwhelming," he said, suddenly fixing himself against the hardened surface. Roots and stones covered the ground, tall pines surrounded them both as they took a quick moment out to reflect. "I can see that. You seem like the more mature type, not just a wisecrack. Every family has them, right? My sister's a little more conserved than I am, but I'm not much different, so I'd say we just have the plain, boring sisterhood. Probably nothing like your brother and you," she said, glancing at him, then towards the infant with her. "It's funny, just before we got here my brother and I seen a little boy just like yours. My brother told me babies are the last thing he could care for. He's probably right about it. I'm glad the man hasn't made any. Would have been a disaster. God must have his eyes open at all times," he said, wondering about him. "I'm sure you're right. I I some thing you it me." She gasped as if her breath had been pummeled out of her tiny body. Immediately, she dropped onto the messy surface, falling a foot from the carriage, putting her arm against her back as if feeling for something. He stared in disbelief, unable to see from behind her. High trees covered the backdrop. She began squirming against the dirt, peering at him in agony. Her face was pale and she was shivering. "Help me, please," she moaned, unable to get up, struggling to find her words. His eyes were now the size of overgrown walnuts, and observing her, he quickly knelt down towards her and realized something had stuck her, puncturing her spinal cord. Not just something, but a hefty lawn dart. The tail end of it was covered in her blood, and she was losing it rapidly. "Oh Jesus, hun, you're going to be all right. Just stay calm and don't move. I'll bring you help. I'll take your boy with me. Here, take this," he said, trying hard to ease her mind. The dart was driven into her and spewing about the ground where she laid sobbing. It wouldn't be long before she would lose all consciousness. He laid his shirt over her wound and clutched the carriage, not taking another second to waste time. Her life was on the line. "I'll hurry for the lodge. Just lay and try not to speak too much. Be right back, I promise," he shrieked, watching her as he took hold of its handles, sprinting back into the trees where the path opened and closed the further in. She said nothing, laying there in the clearing, a desert-like opening where only slabs of broken rock and animal feces remained there after the storm a couple nights prior. He could hear the loons in the distance, calling out against the trees. He observed the pathway as he pushed the shaky cart, trying not to topple it with the infant inside. The infant was enjoying every minute as he sprinted along the darkness of the woods. His hands were clapping and he was making baby noises in his seat. "Oh Lenny boy, oh boy, leeny booey, he the air," hollered a familiar voice from in the trees, halting him and the infant, and the noisy bearings. He stared about, unable to him, but could hear his boots dawdling against the dried leaves. "And I'm the marathon runner, you say? What do you got there? Jesus, for the love of Mary, you have a baby boy!" he shouted again. This time he exited out from the thick brush, holding one of them darts. Lenny stared at him, confused and in desperation to get help for the infant's mother, who had been wounded and needed him. "You sack of shit, you did this?" he cried at him, noticing the lawn dart cradled in his hands. As he neared him, he rocked it from side to side, as if it were the infant calmly sitting beside his brother. "Did what?" "Oh no, I didn't do anything. I found this back there. It's kind of groovy, isn't it? Sharp as a nun's tit." "Really?" he said, giggling quietly. "It was stuck into a tree just up over that embankment. I just took it as a trinket, something to remember these woods for," he said, approaching him. "What you got over there, Yunjin? Jesus, you sure are the Spitfire, aren't you?" I turn around for one moment and poof, you were gone for God knows how long, and I was searching almost everywhere for you. I find you, and I get the 3rd degree?" he said, peering at him. "Well, congratulations, young man. Looks like I'm the last one in on your latest masquerade. Thank you for spilling your guts out on me that I'm an uncle. Just when I thought we were catching up, I get a doozy thrown on me, don't I?" he said, chuckling at him, holding the razor-sharp dart, twisting the blade against his palm, studying the sun glinting from it. He ran his finger across the blade until it pierced deep into his finger. "These things can be lethal. That sure bit me, didn't it? Wouldn't wanna catch one of these by mistake," he said, gawking at the child. "He doesn't look much like you. I would have gotten a blood test done, maybe 2, maybe 3. Shit, you're a joke. You're fooling yourself, Lenny. A baby? A motherfucking shit breeder? You ain't got the berries to take care of no child. Are you confident you're the father, Len? Broads these days don't pay much mind on who they be sleeping with, do they now?" he said. Again he sniggered and peered once more into the carriage. Lenny gawked at him. "Don't fucking kid with me, Mart. You did it, didn't you? You twisted motherfucker, you slippery snake. You better hope she makes it," he cried at him, placing his hands against the stroller. He grasped the handle. He then began to push again. "You're going back, you're scumbag. I never thought I'd feel this much torment for someone, but I do for you. You're not fit to be out, the man you are, what you are definitely not of my kin, not anymore. We're done. Good luck on your ride back to the joint, you will need every bit of it," he said, enthralled in astonishment and hatred for his brother. "Stop right there, you brown-nose Peter blower, you always were the weak link, weren't you? I knew it, even our father knew it. He might not have said anything, but he knew you were the leftovers of the bunch. Not one seed in you makes you any different than the rest of them. You never had one spurn of backbone in you, did you?" he said, holding the dart towards him in one hand. "Here, hit me with it, you know you wanna. Shoot, it'll lay on the ground right now, just take it and drop it into my cranium, see if it bothers me any," he said, peering at him. "Just like I said, another coward, another wasted breath of life. I brought you up here and you throw it in my face. I could have given you a new life, one that matters. Forget it, you aren't cut out to be in with us," he said. His face was cold and callous. He stared at him another second before turning away towards the child. "In with who? You're out there, Martin. You're not making any type of goddamn sense to me. I'm not you. I'll never be like you," he said, breathing heavy, glaring at him. "Our father is dead, Mart. He has no say. He can't speak on his behalf. Say whatever you want. When I get to the lodge, I'm calling the park ranger," he shouted, clutching the stroller. "You better cross your fingers for that woman's life. You better hope she makes it, because if she doesn't, it will be the gas chamber for you, buddy. And just so you know, I won't be there to watch that either," he said, shaking his head in frustration. Just before he could push the carriage away, Martin responded by throwing the deadly dart, nearly missing him, as it landed into the path in front of him. "I won't miss next time, Lenny. I'm a heck of a shot. Just ask little Ms. Mommy back along the pathway, she knows all about it. I'd hurry if I were you. I'd say about in 10 minutes or less she will be as bloodless as a hog in the slaughterhouse," he said, smiling at him, with his eyes gleaming. "You're just lucky I didn't string her up like one, oinkety, fucking oinkwere." He mimicked a dying boar, with the most memorable imitation he could muster, pressing his thumb against the tip of his nose, holding it as if he were mocking the dying woman along the ground, and then spun back into the trees, leaving him alone with the infant. As quick as he had seen him, he was nowhere to be seen now from behind the high plantation. "No worries, your mother will pull it out, just have some faith, little guy, keep thinking of that, don't let him scare you," he whispered towards the infant rocking in his seat. Although it wasn't exactly truthful, he himself was petrified. He observed the woods behind him where Martin had entered, and seen only the trees surrounding them, blowing mildly against the mountain breeze. "There isn't much time, we have to get Mommy and bring her with. I don't trust that guy, whoever he says he is, he's not my blood relation." He began talking to him, twisting the carriage in her direction. He faced the path, staring into the trees. He began the uphill battle heading back to her, understanding each moment was critical for her. Chapter 16, Critical Limit. He gripped the carriage, shoving it through the path. He could hear the woman, or someone in the distance. "I'm on my way, you hang strong, I'm going to get you back to the car, we will get you help," he hollered, wheeling the infant forcefully into the thick of the woods, hoping she would hear them. Lenny dashed frantically for the clearing, where the woods opened into a leveled grove of jagged rocks and habitats for the wood's inhabitants. A voice cried for him from behind. Before he could spit himself at whoever it was, he felt something pierce the back of his neck. An instant sensation overcame him, a warm, feverish feeling immediately radiated through his chest and down into his staggering legs, bringing all of his weight to his knees as he buckled to the surface. His fingers fought against the dirt as he stumbled overwhelmingly, falling into a sleep-like daze, collapsing flat against the ground, where his heart began to slow and he could no longer move. His mind raced, peering at the carriage a foot from him, wondering if it were Mart, if he had injected him, and with what? His eyes gazed about, from one end to the other, in front of him, seeing nobody in the woodland surrounding the two. Suddenly, he heard someone hiding behind his limp body, their boots dragging against the soil. He could hear them breathing softly as they approached him. He struggled to alert the woman with his weakening body inches above the dirt, fighting to use his knees for support and his elbows for balance. "I can't, I'm sorry, get help," he cried faintly, until his mind went black. He was disoriented, unable to think straight, everything was a blur. His eyes began to roll, quaking inside as they shed water down onto his face, closing momentarily and opening before they went completely dim. It wasn't long after, he could smell something strong, potent. The odor caught his nostrils as he breathed closely against the land. He could hear the gravel shifting underneath someone's boots, stepping over him. "This should do it, smelling salt. My mother, God rest her soul, used this stuff once when I was sick as a dog with the shingles. I was probably about 6 or 7 and them days were a lot different than now. This here ammonium carbonate will shock you right up out of it, if nothing else will. Can you hear me, Lenny?" "Hey, Lenny, oh boy, I think we have a rookie. You know that shit's known to sedate cancer patients, right? How much did you put in that thing when you dosed him?" A man's voice instigated, questioning whoever it was with him. "It's just Valium, punk bitch, don't try to bully me, kid. I have about 30 years on you. You were still in diapers when this all started," hollered the same unfamiliar voice from a moment ago, arguing back with another man. Lenny wondered where he was, confused and disoriented as he laid in total darkness and unable to see. He wondered what they had done to him, with the infant, and the mother. "Wake him up, he's been out of the fold for too long, any longer and we might have to do him in. I know you two have a ton of time together but we can't be jeopardizing the order," the roughened voice of an older man immediately warned him. "You understand the rules and how they operate, your father knew them best of all, he taught you young. Why he hadn't brought him in sooner baffles me." The same man spoke. Lenny could hear him and the distinct sound of something still alive squirming in the high coppice not far from him. He attempted to speak, but he was groggy and his face was numb. "I understand that, If he doesn't comply with it or with us, I'll cut his throat like Junior's over there, brother or not. It's in motion now, we can't back out. This is our day of retribution. The last to bleed will be the one who is chosen, and the first to die will be the offering," Martin said, convincing him. He's sounding indifferent, phlegmatic and devious. Lenny finally opened his eyes, but could only hear them in the dark. "Martin? Who are you with? Stop this please. Is the infant and the woman all right? Please tell me you haven't hurt her?" he cried, sobbing against the debris-riddled surface. His hands were tethered and behind him, laying on his chest. Dry dirt and stones from the earth covered his mouth and lips, tasting it, as he spoke. "What is this about? I can't see shit. Come on, what is this about? I want to fucking hear it from you," he shouted, kicking against the hardened ground, where his legs were roped tight together. "Is she all right? Speak to me," he pleaded with him, although the two voices in the distance ignored him as he cried, disoriented and alone. Immediately, someone flicked a match, creating a short glimmer of light as it died off, sending him back into darkness. His eyes felt unhinged, as they adjusted to the surrounding woods. He could sense something crawling on him, as he wrestled himself to get loose. "Something is on me, damn it, get it off, come on Mart!" he shrieked. Tears were now streaming from his soiled face. "Do I not amount to nothing anymore? I was there for you all of them times, even when I shouldn't have been. This is how you leave me. All of those times as kids, I covered for your ass, even when it meant my hide or my reputation," he wailed in horror. He then listened for them to speak, suddenly hearing the shuffling in the woods not far away, but clearly it was someone in pain. A moment later, somebody a foot from him in the dark struck another match, as it fizzled and blew up into a small hurling flame of smoke and fire. His eyes again struggled to visually adapt to the nightfall, and they did slowly as they came into view, briskly startling him. The woman laying in the vegetation was covered in blood, her eyes were missing and her tongue had been amputated from her shivering mouth, as it sputtered to make sense of whatever violence had occurred while he was out. Her top teeth were busted out, some hung from her mouth, barely in her gums, as her body convulsed inches from him. He peered in terror, frozen to the sight of her. Her forehead was gashed and oozing, he could see the bone underneath, protruding from it, causing him to gasp and turn away a split moment. Again, he stared at her, wondering what his brother had become, or if he always was. Her arms were butchered from her and laying in the fire. He could see her fingers stretching out of the smoke as if they were still attached. He stared at the smoke as it rose into the night, sending ash and burnt flesh into the air. Martin was sitting on a oddly shaped stone at the fire, heating something on a twig. As he watched his evil brother, his eyes heavily watering against his face, at the sight of it, as he wriggled to get away but wasn't able. "Mart, come on. Get these restraints off me. I can't help you if you don't help me, come on," he bellowed loudly, until the other person with him came over and stood over him. "You might not know this, Len, but my family were the first up here. It wa'n't by my doing, but it had to be done. As hard as it was, I knew it wa'n't my decision to make. We please our master by unburdening ourselves of wasted lives. We live for him. Blood relation has no say in who goes and who doesn't. It's not by choice, it's by his demand," the older man explained, reaching down to grab hold of him. He clutched his shoulder swiftly, yanking him into a sitting position against the stones. He remained silent, thinking of a way to escape. "This could be harder now, we have to take this delicately. Most of us don't join the pack this late in time. I'm still iffy about him," Mart the man said. Finally he let go of him and plopped down with him at his side. His face was old, wrinkled, and familiar at the same time, strangely familiar. "You don't remember me, do you? You were just a boy when we met. Your father and I were good friends a lifetime ago," he said, staring at him. He appeared normal, for the most part, but Lenny knew otherwise. "You can't manipulate me. I'm not Martin. I'm not drowning in sorrow. I don't fucking kill people," he shouted angrily at him, causing the man to put his hand out towards him. "Watch your blubbering mouth out here. This isn't the place or time to be calling your own shots, Len. This is having belief in something more. This has its own magnificent rewards. We give a tiny tribute and we get a kingdom of gold. You see what I'm getting at? Your brother begged the order to allow you in. Are you worth the risk? It's either yes or no. You dear boy can be the missing cog, don't you see? Or you can be the lamb, and we all know what happens to lambs out here," he said, gently patting him against the neck. "We slaughter lambs," he said, releasing his hand. Martin turned from the fire and peered at him, holding a piece of graham cracker, chocolate and marshmallow together on a stick. They stared eye to eye, for just a moment. He glared at him against the ground, devouring it, licking it from his soppy fingers, grunting to himself. "In or out, Len?" He questioned him from afar, quickly. Standing from the stone he approached him. A foot from him he leaned towards the ground where a man-made mound had been sculpted, for whatever reason. In the dark he emerged, lifting the bone-handled buck knife from it, wrapping his left hand around it. He stepped closer to him, sitting with the older male. "Die with the bitch or live eternal? It's your choice. Either way, the last to die is his offering, and at this point, she's looking shabby over there, so that would leave just you," he said, putting the bloodied knife down into his brother's hands. His hands were tight against one another, tethered together as if he had been praying. "Hold onto it tightly, and come with me and let's get our reward. All that bitch is a useless fat, baby-making heifer. I know you see it, we all do," he said, sounding dark and demented. His face was red, still soiled in the buck's blood. Everything was showing now. Lenny could see it. There were no other methods for him to reach him. His brother was lost, the whole thing insanity. "Heifer? Mart, she's a fucking mother, she just had a child. Where did you put him? I wanna know, motherfucker, where is he?" he cried, desperately scanning the woods. There were no whimpers, no cries, and no baby noises in the night, just the silence and the sound of the fire. Martin glared at him, and put his hand over his eyes, shielding his view. "Right there, that's him, in the dark, where there is nothing. He's dead, all right," he said, taking his hand from his face, uncovering him. "It takes a ton of blood to fill the belly of the beast, gallons if I'm to be exact. She's the last if you hurry," he said, whispering into his ear. "Now, take this bloody knife and come. I have the passage right here. Father left it for me to find, you know, the day he died," he added, pulling him by the arm. Lenny held the tainted blade, facing it downwards, being led by his only brother to the dying woman. "I'll recite it. You just cut into her chest, make sure you cut just below her breasts, sever the heart stem and hand it to Phil," he explained to him, as if it were just a natural thing, a ordinary act for him. "Phil Bettens will put everything else into motion. He's been one of the longest-known founders of our occult," he said, peering at him across the way, where he was now sipping from a ceramic mug. He could hear the sound of it swoosh down his throat, wondering what it was, if it were something more, something god-awful. Lenny stared again at him, suddenly remembering the name. It hit him like a pile of bricks. "Phil? Phil Bettens? I remember you. I can't believe it. You were at the fire when the woman burned to death. You wanted my father to help her, but he wouldn't. He won't with the department any longer," he cried aloud, immediately recalling the terrible night it all happened. He envisioned himself there as if it were that evening, just a helpless boy, holding on to his father, fighting the cold and watching the smoke curl from the home. He could see their faces, all of the commotion out on the street, watching up at it, doing nothing. He gawked at Phil again. "You two were fighting. I didn't think he liked you much," he said. "It was nothing, but it appeared so real, just two old men with different reasons. At least I thought so at the time. Why would you care if she died? Why kill now? You wanted to save her, didn't you?" he cried at him, studying the man who knew his father. Chapter 17, No Stranger. Phil Bettens approached him. Martin left them together and headed back towards the rock where he was sitting a moment earlier. Ignore her a moment, Len. We will get back to that in a second. Listen to me, boy. At the time, I thought I had a revelation, but after my family died in a hail of hellfire, it made me question it all, my values, my beliefs. In the end, I had no more time for the Holy Bible and its God, and all of its meaningless scripture, he said, holding his shoulder again. Take a seat and listen up, Lenny. She's not moving anywhere. Don't pay her mind, he said, asking him to shut out the struggling woman. I was through with living the way I had. I felt dead inside and out. I woke up and remember feeling as if I were not even human. I didn't think the same. My mental state was at a crossroads. I just wanted to burn the way my wife and kids had. There's no better way than hell, right? He added, chuckling quietly, peering at Mart across the way, slightly nodding at him. So I gave myself to the master, the same way Mike had after your mother left, he said, speaking of Mike Kozova, and how their marriage was on the rocks and ultimately ended in separation. It wasn't much longer after that, witnessing that poor woman smacking her dying fists against that glass to get out, I understood, just then, he said, continuing his story. That evening when I laid down to rest my head, I couldn't sleep. I'd sit up and think, and listen to the wind outside. I had a half-dozen shots of bourbon and thought about it all some more, laid down again, tossing and turning until it all rushed to me, and when it did, I could see something in the darkness that resembled my family, but we had so much more now, and we were together again as if nothing changed, he said, smiling at him, slightly blinking. I could have been just like her, fighting to get out, but out of what? I pondered that quite a while, he said, glaring at him. His eyes were dark in the night. What if I were to break the pact? That's a blood oath. Would I be willing to die and salvage nothing of my previous life, my morally correct life? And if I did, I too would have been in there with her, he said, catching Martin's attention as he stood against the blazing fire. Lenny eyeballed him and said nothing, clutching the knife. Lenny finally broke his silence and stared at him, face to face in the night. You sacrificed your family for this? For a make-believe fantasy world? There is no Satan, there is nothing after death, Phil. You think if you kill me or anyone else in that matter that you will really get a better life? He shouted at him, paying attention to his face. Phil glared at him momentarily, with a devilish expression covering his wrinkled skin. I'll let that slide. Yes, it's realer than anything you could ever see with the naked eye. Satan is not the enemy. The enemy to us is a religion where you believe in a higher power, and have no proof of his existence, except for the scriptures. And who said what? Do you think that's enough? I'll show you something. I'll give you the evidence you need, young man, he said, laying his mug down against the darkness. He peered at him, wondering if it were true, hesitating to react. He spoke again. What did Martin mean when he talked of the words my father wrote? He asked him, with a gritty smirk on his face. Martin again got up and plodded in his direction. His face appeared serious and stern. He then spoke, taking a seat against another stone not far from him. It was shaped oddly. It had been moved at one given time to use as a resting spot, for whatever reason. A passage. Len, I told you I had a surprise for you, something miraculous, something only our God can give, earthly rewards greater than any man has set his eyes upon, he said, softly, pushing him towards the woman. Her face was now a blip of her previous athletic self. Do it, and your life will matter. No more empty boxes of pancake mix or cans crowding your kitchen table in loneliness. You can have the sweet joy of money and fortune, jewels, sex, anything you ever desired. He whispered, nodding his head. Lenny's hands began to shake. He shook his head at him, denying him. I won't, I can't, go to hell. Nothing is worth selling out for. All of the fortunes in the world aren't enough for such an act. It's an abomination, Martin. He hollered. God or no God, I'd never side with someone so diabolical. You're the devil, Martin. You tried to crush me to death under Pop's car when we were little. Don't think I've forgotten about it. I know the truth now, he said, gawking at him, while the knife shook uncontrollably in his grasp. Martin and Phil both watched him, before the woman on the ground broke their concentration. "Please, Lenny, can you hear me?" she cried, faintly in the dark, unable to see him, missing both of her eyes. Her broken face chattered, attempting to speak, as blood trickled from her lips. "My boy, is he all right?" he sputtered, asking him, hearing him as he argued. Lenny ignored her, unable to find the courage to speak, controlling the blade, resting it against his forearm. "You didn't bring help, did you?" she sobbed, crying, her words jumbled inside of her mouth, wriggling her severed tongue. Lenny peered at his brother, futile. Hatred ate at him for what he had done to her. If there is something as sinister as a demonic presence, one like the Bible portrays, or if it's just a fabrication to scare children into doing right, however bizarre it all sounds, I know painstakingly, I'm nothing like you or Phil or any of the other satanic, black magic practitioners there are out there," he shouted, spitting dirt at him, gripping the knife. Martin suddenly peered over at Phil, who was parched against slab of driftwood by the fireplace. Both stared a moment, then nodding at each other, strangely communicating with one another in silence. Martin immediately pried himself from the seat, swatting a swarm of mosquitoes from his face, approached him. He then knelt at his side. "I'll take that back. You want validation, don't you? Here, I'll let you run away, back to the outside world, the foolish Christian world, where you believe nothing can get you, where you can feel safe and sleep in your bed at night with no concerns. But if we catch you, then you're going through with it. I mean, you're going to wrench out that whore's guts, and it won't stop there. You're going to dance around her fucking corpse with us and do exactly what it takes," he said, giving him an ultimatum. Chapter 18, Go Now. Here is the kicker, Lenny. Now, if you get away, scot-free, Signora, finito, then you can do as you please, call the authorities all you want, have us sent away, whatever it be, don't think twice about it, just do it, but I have a hunch. You ain't getting out of this, it's been decided, your fate awaits you, like it or not," he said, using the blade. He pushed it against the restraints and slit them until they dropped against the dark. "Time's ticking, go now, before these woods grab hold of you the way they did us," his brother shrieked, wielding the handled knife in his hand. Lenny jumped up from the dirt and stone-covered platform, ignoring the ghastly sight of the woman, and the emptied carriage pushed against the trees in the backdrop. He ignored the thought of the child, and bolted. His hands and legs rapidly sprinting for the path, where the dark of night painted the woods as if it were a water-based painting of the Black Sea. He was unable to locate the entranceway where his hands hit plant after plant, feeling for its exit. The moon was half the size from a night earlier, shining slightly down onto him, hurrying for the car. As he ran, he pondered deeply, of his brother and Phil, his father, the woman burning, the hunter in the woods, and his rifle laying in the plush snow, and how his face was frozen in regret, and then of the infant's mother, and how she appeared so alive yet so gone at the same moment, and then the infant, who was nowhere to be found. It swayed against his mind, as he hurtled over broken branches and clumps of dirt from the storm. His legs were toothpicks as he scurried through the dark, finally reaching the opening. He could sense them, not far from him, ridiculing him, almost teasing him to get away. They were sniggering in the dark, almost floating against the nightfall, effortlessly chasing him. The wind began to blow again, hitting him forcefully as he tore through the trail, almost losing himself. They were almost at his back, reaching for him. He could feel the warmth of their hands ready to clutch onto him, as he charged into the hard wind. His mind was crying for the woman, for not doing more, for leaving her there with them. A few minutes later, he came to a steady jog. Spinning back, he fought to see them, but there was only the trees shuddering in the death-defying breeze. He peered from side to side, wondering what to expect. Another lawn dart, a stray slug in the back, his brother's buck knife. He fought himself to go on, but the thought of the infant was too much. He stepped against the nearest tree and held onto it, almost holding himself from crumbling over. Deciding to run for the lodge, he quickly lost hope. Without having the keys, his mind barreled back to his brother and Phil, but he knew in certainty he could never overpower them both. He could hear the water running not far from him, where the lake split off into a stream only yards from the path. He decided to follow it, hoping to find his way through the dark. He felt the trees as he ran for it, listening closely, not to fall trap of the woods. He could hear them breathing heavy in the distance, as he stumbled, and came to a sudden stop between the trees, where a new path closed in on him. A path that was made, not from human hands, but from the flooding a few nights prior. He listened again, hearing the gurgling sound of fresh spring water rolling off from the hill, where it emptied into a stream. He fought to find it, putting his hands against the trees as he passed them. The wood was rotten there, peeling against his fingertips. He peered upwards, admiring the moon, keeping himself hidden in the trees, where he hugged the tree land, hoping to camouflage himself. Without warning, he heard them sniggering in the darkness. They were near, but he was unable to identify where they were. Their odious snickering seemed to be everywhere at once. His ears perked up, as he studied the woodland, quickly dashing for the other end of the woods where he managed to see the outline of a tower. He pressed on, fighting through the leaves and thorn bushes, pricking him as he squeezed through where the tower stood isolated just yards from the stream. "Lenny, Lenny, we can see you, you can't get away from the eye, it sees everything," saturated a disturbing voice, his brother's, as it swirled against his left ear and died off into the darkness. He spun to see him, but he was alone, standing at the tower, towering above him in the moonlight. "There's no time, you're coming back, you're one of us, it's been written." Again, the same voice spoke in the trees behind him. Panicking, he ignored it, climbing onto the stairs leading up. It was a lighthouse, unlike anything he had seen in the woods previously. It was an unconventional location for one. The stream was calm, and there were no vessels capable of docking there in such shallow waters. He wondered about it, as he reached the platform high above ground. His hands were shivering, he was exhausted and panicking as he clutched the door. Turning the handle, it was sealed. As he yanked it, it moved not at all. Cautious of the noises surrounding him, he ducked behind the railing leading down towards ground level. He slid to the surface where he noticed the trees in the distance, leading back into the woods. They were still quivering in the unusual wind. Immediately, he left the tower, quietly making his way to the stream. Peering at it in the night, the black water splashed mildly against the land where he stood. He turned around to catch a glimpse of the woodland. Above the forest, a shadow covered the woods overtop. It was barely visible from where he was, overcasting the night sky, unnerving him. The shape of something enormous, something chilling and unworldly draped about the scenic environment. He could feel his heart pacing underneath his skin, as he rested along the edge of the stream. His face covered in wet, in dirt and somebody else's blood. He touched his face, feeling it. The scent of the woman somehow had gotten on him. In the distance a strange sound began to resonate from within the high trees. He imagined it being them, searching for him. He briskly pushed his foot closer until his shoe touched the water. It wandered silently, listening to the peculiar noise, wondering how deep it would become, if he were enter for any reason. Across from the stream he could see something also. Something left behind, possibly a life ring. His eyes fixed against it, bravely he stepped into the water as it rose to his waist. The stream was wide and became a bit more rapid as he inched through it, reaching the center where a steep rock blocked anything in its way. Somebody had thrown it in, possibly attempting to build a dam, failing in long run. Lenny gripped onto it, fighting not to slip underneath the moving water. The water burped and spit at him as he pulled his body onto it, catching the splashing water against his face. The rock was crumbling under him. As he let go, pushing his hands out, he used them to thrust through it, hoping to make it to the other side. Without hesitation, he slipped against the sand underneath the water. Going under, he bounced against the stones and came back up. He spit the water from his mouth, anchoring himself down. He used his shoes, dragging each step as carefully as he could. He bent his body forward, leaning towards the other end of the stream, where it laid for some time. The noise behind him had gotten louder and much more distinct, the sound of something vibrating, something clattering. He faced the land, hurrying, stepping out from the water where he climbed atop, awaiting the noise to come for him. The wind continued to push him, as he laid his eyes against it. A small metal shed, left to rot, was leaning against the foreground, but that wasn't all. He stared at it, slowly approaching it, listening to the clattering out behind the trees. Rocks and debris had washed up from the stream, making the short journey something to remember. His shoes were caked in it, heavy as he worked his tired body to get to it. A orange safety box hung from it. Behind it, he wondered if it still had something he could use. Coming upon it, he lifted the hinge, swinging it towards him, in hopes of a flare gun and some flares. His face immediately turned wet, it was empty. He cursed the wind hitting him, as he studied the only thing that could have salvaged his life. There was a compartment for 6 flares, but they were also missing. Behind him, the unjust noise from a bit ago caught his attention. The continuing noise had suddenly grown deadly quiet. The hair against his body began to rise. He noticed how desolate the night had become, even the wind had tired itself out, leaving only him in the shadows. Chapter 19, In Need of Help. Immediately, a set of hands touched him, spinning him around until he fell flat against the night. Martin stood above him, slightly smirking, grinning heinously at him. Lenny stared up at him, feeling paralyzed for that long drawn-out moment. He was holding it over him, the infant's rattle. "What did I tell you, Lenny? You don't see it like we do you?" "Nobody ever does," he muttered, the night moon shining down against him. His vicious face radiated underneath it, glaring at him, almost as if he were being punished. "Martin, who are you? I don't understand, are you not there anymore?" He questioned him, backing away, almost growling. His hands trembled against the muddy water, where the wind had splashed it. Behind him, Phil Bettens approached them, as he glided effortlessly through the stream. His soulless body barely touching the water. Frightened, Lenny suddenly shrieked at him, "You're a daemon, aren't you? What did you do to get this deep? Was it witchcraft? Were you always so hateful of me?" He asked him, but Martin stood motionless before him. His face, still spattered in animal flesh, as he glared villainously towards him. He remained on the surface, hands sopping of fishy water. He awaited Phil, as he hit the land, sweeping up onto it as if his feet were made of nothing more than dark energy. He began to cackle again, reaching the 2 seasons greetings, little man. "You should have known better than to run away," Phil muttered, laying his arm on Martin's back. "Together forever, and death is the only way to reunite," he said. His hair was disarray and blown back, reminding him a bit of his father. "Your brother never told you, did he?" he said, glaring at him. Both were. A noxious smell blew in. He ignored it, listening to him, as he inched his way further from them. He could feel the evil in front of him, holding the ground in unspeakable terror. Phil's mouth opened wide, showing his sinister, blood-stained teeth. "The hunter you both found, you thought it was suicide, right? When you noticed his lever-action rifle and all that icky, sticky, brain matter. Now that was a sight, want it? A young innocent child, just playing in the woods, want it?" he said, waving his finger at him. He began to lick his mouth, tasting whoever's blood it was. "You sure didn't help him either, did you? Just like the bitch back there, and that freakish-looking infant of hers. Boy, you don't do much good being here, do you?" he said, scolding him, his brother standing along. His eyes blinked continuously as he spoke, as if something was happening. "That was all your father's doing, not ours, so, you think you're something special, right?" he said, putting his fingers against his chin. Lenny watched him, now sitting steady. He stared at his brother's face as it began to fade, something he hadn't seen before. His face was quivering in the dark, as if something was picking him apart one piece at a time. His eyes turned back, showing the whites of them, and his nose, lips and ears began to convert into something horrible, frightening him half to death. He was stuck against the mud, with his fingers clawing to get away. Phil and Martin stood there converting, changing in the darkness. He could feel the blood rushing through him, as he slid backwards hitting the wall of the rickety shed. He trembled at the sight of them, demons, he wondered how but couldn't grasp the thought of it. His fingernails raking against the soil, he immediately thought of something not of this world. The mutating couple were now howling in excitement and contorting a foot from him in the night sky. Their faces were now foul and unworldly. They both glared at him, momentarily as if they had caught prey. The expressions on their faces were that of beasts, and not of human composition. "Mart? Phil? You in there?" he shrieked, not believing his own eyes. They were gawking at him, contorting inches from the surface. Their nails had yellowed and were long, stretching until they bled from their fingertips. As he stared, he felt around the dark, where the ground was moist and covered in debris. "Stay back, both of you!" he shouted, suddenly sensing something in his fingers. He picked at it, until he had two sticks in his hand, fighting to put them together. He made a crucifix. "I told you to stay back, you motherfuckers!" he cried, desperate to get away. They stared at him a moment, the yellow growing in their eyes as it turned dark, and black and then blacker. Their eyes were no more, they were hollow and lost. "Back off, now!" he cried, sobbing, worried for himself, worried for the woman and her child. Something inside of them, demonic, putrid and burning to get loose, stared at him with total disgust. He could feel them breathing in it, the foul, sinful nature of them and how they worked. He clutched the cross, holding them together in his grasp, but nothing happened. They converted, sliding against the night at him, growling for a taste of his blood. Immediately, he broke away, flopping into the water where the stream hit him once again. In the water, he sank against the plantation underneath. Heavy stones and wild plants began to strangle his shoes. He couldn't move. Putting his hands in the water, he tore away at it, fighting to get out. The water was becoming darker surrounding him as he fought to get across. He spun to see the two. They were coming over, both hovering along the land. Their arms were out, and their grotesque fingernails were wielding in his direction. He forced his foot, breaking the hold on him, moving hastily to the other end of the stream. Passing the light tower, he approached the woodland yet again, miraculously making it through the forceful water. He broke through the trees, cutting his hands as he ran deep into the dark. Searching for a way out, he remembered at Watfar, where Martin had tossed the deadly lawn dart at him. The trees surrounding him were familiar, and the moon seemed to be shining much brighter now. He could see the path from earlier, when he had the infant. He forced his mind from it, accelerating, darting through the forestry without his brother's car keys, without anything, no protection, only the woods for survival. A moment later, he found the path, but there wasn't any dart nearby. He wondered if he had mistaken or if he had only imagined it being there. The path was a wreck, stones and muddy water saturated it where he came to a steady sprint. He pondered to himself again, wishing more from himself, the imaginary cries of the infant now forcing him to kneel against the dirt. He put his hand against the dirt, holding himself up, crying for her and for him. Not far from him, the trees quaked as if someone had ran into them with something heavy. He peered at them, and then back at the path before him. He realized he had to get back to the woman, and rummage for the infant. If he were alive, he could get him to his father. It didn't make sense, being out there after all. He should have realized it sooner, but it would matter, if only he could help the infant from being the next offering. The woods again became a place of desolation and isolation. He could hear only himself picking through the trees to find his way closer to the fire. His heartbeat was pounding, his chest was drumming like a drum. He thought of the little boy, regretting not getting them out when his brother went missing. Chapter 20, dark woods. A short while later, he found himself at the brink of exhaustion. He stumbled against the surface, holding his side, where his chest hurt from running. The path was opening up ahead and he could see something bright in the distance, where the trees had grown high and stood above the path. He ached, making it closer, listening for the two in the dark, but heard only the crisp sound of wood and dried leaves burning on an open flame. He silently stepped against the surface, paying attention to the surrounding woods. He heard no animals, no wind, only himself. Every movement was like paper being crumbled in someone's fingers. His shoes and feet were drenched in water from the stream. The midnight air was cold but blowing subtle against him as he neared the camp. The woman's cries were nowhere to be heard. He listened for them as he made it to the stone where Martin sat, just inches from the heat. He sat down a moment, glaring out for them to return, but seen only the night in the distance. The untamed fire crackled and snapped, sending ash onto him, sitting by it. It felt nice, as he reached against the heat, warming his fingers. He stood up, pondering the infant's whereabouts, and the hushed sound of the woman dying in the high grass. Staring against the dark, he reached towards the burning wood, where a branch suspending from the pit of fire was dangling near him. He snatched it, holding it away, as it burned on one end. Smoke filled the air, as he neared the high weeds, in hopes of finding them. Using the flame to see, he waved it, causing the fire to flicker, lighting the ground beneath him. He noticed blood droplets leading away from the fire. Feeling fearful, he began to follow them, observing them in the dark. Sluggishly, he stepped across the stone and dirt, lighting the woods with his torch until he discovered her still body. His jaw dropped, distressed, at the very sight of seeing her. She was dismembered, only shreds of her clothing and what was left from her slaughtering laid there, in reminder of who she was. Forcing the fire from her, he shined the burning brush against the woods, where the clearing became much darker, horrifyingly darker. The trees were sweeping gently surrounding him with moving shadows. He lifted the torch high, to see inside, where the weeds covered something from his point of view. The glow of the torch shot against the scenic landscape in front of him, as he observed what it was, until something from behind him caught his concentration, terrifying him. It was different than earlier. It was the sound of slow footsteps, carefully dawdling in the woods nearby. He stared, with his eyes prospecting the woods on the far side of him, only catching a sudden glimpse of something large moving away. Panicking, he poked the torch towards it, hoping whatever it was nothing but the woods playing shadow games with him. Again, he spun towards the weeds, hesitantly approaching whatever it was just out of his reach. He fixed the torch in front of himself, for just a moment, until the noise appeared yet again, causing him to jump nervously. He held the fire out, from side to side, he waved it against the nightfall, only seeing the shadows of the landscape draping over the deserted clearing. He studied it a long moment, awaiting it. A second later, he decided to abandon whatever it was, lying there, heading further into the clearing where he had seen the infant's carriage tossed recklessly against the tree. Approaching it, the stroller was in tatters, bent all to hell, its wheels slashed and absent, thrown against the dry dirt not far from him. Inside the carriage was a small pool of blood, not enough to assume anything, but the dreadful thought of it bothered him. He put his hand inside, touching the blood, realizing it had been there for a good length of time, giving him a slight sense of relief. He wondered if it were the infant's mother's. Leaving it as it were, he sat again, wondering if both Phil and Martin were out there, enraged, seeking to find him. The fire blew against his face as he